Welcome back. We are here, season two of Lessons from the Boot. I'm kind of sitting here thinking, where did September go? So, for those of you who don't know, I took the month of September off. I've been working on something behind the scenes, which I'm really excited to talk about in today's episode. But I also wanted to have like a natural pause between the seasons on my podcast. I think it's important sometimes. It gives a little bit of structure to my podcast in general. And it also gives people time to digest previous episodes that they might not have had time to catch up on. So it felt right to have the month of September off. But I have to be honest, the month absolutely flew by. Like normally for me, it is the month of August that goes by in a flash. But this year, August was that little bit slower, and it was September that caught me by surprise. But here we are. We are in October. We are in the last quarter of 2024. And I want to start the first episode of this season off with some fantastic news. So, as I mentioned before, I was working on something behind the scenes in September that really required my attention. So, it was the perfect moment to pause this podcast whilst I focused on it. And that little something was a book. Now, this isn't just any book. This is a book that I decided to do really towards the end of season one of my podcast. I started to get an inkling of an idea that I could actually put all 40 episodes of season one into a book format. And, I had a moment where I was like, but you're crazy, Claire. Who wants to read a book of a podcast? But then I kind of really sat with it and I was like, well, actually, reading something is an entirely different experience to listening to something. Like you activate different parts of your brain, you have different retention. It's a totally different experience. And also, what you may be doing whilst you are listening to something is going to be very different to what you are going to be doing when you're reading something. You're more likely, in a way, to be more focused when you're reading compared to when you're listening to something, because normally you're busy doing something else at the same time. So, for me, it made logical sense to do this. And I really wanted to do this because, as some of you may or may not know, if you follow me on Instagram, my handle is at Miss Brittany. If you don't already, I'll put the links below in the show notes. But I mentioned at the beginning of this year that I was working on a book. And at the beginning of this year, this book was just all based on life in South Italy, like the complexities of life in South Italy. Because as you may already know from having followed me on YouTube or even on this podcast, life here is not easy. It is very, very complicated and testing. And I wanted to just share my experiences in this book. And it was initially going to be called a word that I don't even think I can say on here because for some people it's quite rude. But it was a Sicilian word in dialect that essentially means loads of different things. So it was the perfect word to describe the complexities of life here. But kind of, the more I kind of thought about it and the more I was recording podcast episodes, I realized that a lot of those things I wanted to talk about in that initial book, I was discussing already on my podcast. And so it just made natural sense to blend the two ideas into one. And I'm really excited about this book. So the book is going to be published on the 14th of October. It is currently available for pre-order. I will put all the links below in the show notes, but it's available on all the major publishing platforms, Barnes & Noble, Apple, Amazon, anyone that you can think of, it's there. And I'm really happy because this is the second book that I have written. And it's probably the first book that I can honestly say has a real connection to Italy. Like my first book was based on my own personal struggles and my story from breakdown to breakthrough. But this book is primarily centered on all of the lessons that I have shared with you throughout season one of this podcast. And I just dive a bit deeper into all of the things that I spoke about in season one. And I also share with you like key takeaways and actionable tips that you can apply to your own life to really digest the kind of lessons that I learn on a daily basis from living here in South Italy. So I'm super excited. It is Lessons from the Boot Volume 1, because I do intend to make this a bit of a series every season. And so, yes, go check it out. As I said, I'll put the links below in the show notes. But I think that you'll find it a really interesting read. And I hope that if you are an avid listener, which I know a lot of you are, you can gain something different from it, consuming it in a different way, you know? And I think as well with a podcast, I do recognize that we don't have endless amounts of time. And I do realize that sometimes it's not possible to sit through an entire podcast episode. And the thing with a podcast is you can start listening to it, pause it. But sometimes it's unlikely that you will ever go back to that episode. It's not as easy to pick up where you left off as it is with a book. And so I hope if you are someone who has struggled to catch up with my episodes, or you're not always able to listen to every single episode in full, that this book can be an alternative way for you to consume the lessons that I have shared. And so I am super excited about this. This was one of my goals on my vision board for 2024, and I have done it. And I'm so proud of myself. I've self published my second book. Self publishing is incredible. Like the amount of people that turn their nose up at self publishing because they feel that it has to be for a traditional publishing house in order for it to be a successful book. It's nonsense. A lot of the books that end up getting picked up by publishing houses started off via the self publishing route. And, it's a way to get your work out into the world. If you are just waiting for a publishing house to pick up your work or to approve it, you're going to be waiting a really, really long time. Why do that when you can begin yourself and get your message heard and help people? That's what I think anyway. So this is my news for this episode. I'm so excited to be back. I can't wait to dive deep into all of the lessons that I learned in September and everything else that I continue to encounter here in South Italy on a daily basis. And I will see you in the next episode.